Dear Muslims, today, 100 years ago, one of the greatest political disasters of the last 14 and a half centuries occurred. On the 27th of Rajab, 1342 after the Hijrah, which corresponds to March of 1924, by a decree of the Parliament of Turkey, under the nationalist leader by the name of Mustafa Kemal, otherwise known as Ataturk, the office of the Khilafah was abolished. And the last Khalifa of our Ummah, Sultan Abdul Majid II, the 37th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and the 21st generation descendant of its founder Usman, went into exile and eventually died in Paris in 1944. The 27th of Rajab marks the 100th Hijri anniversary of this sad tragedy. A full century has gone by, and it behooves us to remember, to not commemorate, because that's a positive meaning, but to reflect and to ponder and to study and learn both the good and the bad. And obviously this is a very complex topic. How could this tragedy have happened? For 1,350 years we had a Khilafah, and then all of a sudden, between a morning and an evening, it's gone. And now we have been for 100 years without one. What are the lessons to learn? What do I need to teach, especially the next generation, especially my children and your children? They need to know our heritage, our history. They need to know our civilization. What are the causes of the collapse of the Khilafah, and especially of the Uthmani Khilafah? Many things can be said. Of them, the mismanagement of internal resources and the weakening of the Muslim economy. Of them was for centuries a sense of complacency, a sense of not understanding the threat of other superpowers, because once upon a time, as we all like to reminisce, we ruled the world. For 500 years, we were indeed the greatest civilization. But unfortunately, that led to a sense of complacency, a sense of maybe even a little bit of arrogance. And so, from around 1500 onwards, the Muslim lands began to stagnate technologically, and Western civilization began to rise. And there was not a sense of urgency. It really was not, there was not a sense of awareness of the threat of the rising European powers. As well, during this time frame, the technological achievements of the Western worlds began to far surpass those of Muslim lands, and in particular, the Ottoman army. Also, there was the ossification of the religious clergy, and this is an awkward thing, but it needs to be said. There was this sense of closure, we don't need anything else. And that is why there was a sense of we don't need any technology. I've given an entire lecture about the printing press and why so many scholars did not want the printing press in Muslim lands. That's just an indication of a mindset, if you like. And it is true that some ulama attempted reform, attempted revival. Great thinkers like Rashid Rida, who was very active. The most famous alim 100 years ago was Rashid Rida. May Allah Azza wa Jal have mercy on him. But it was too little, too late. And so what happened, happened. Another major reason for the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was the fact that global superpowers began playing around with Muslim politics. They began eyeing Muslim lands with direct colonization, like the British in India, like the French in Egypt, in Algeria, or with indirect tinkering, like they did with the Ottoman lands. And so European superpowers, France, Germany, England, Russia, they all began to try to influence local politics within the Ottoman lands. And the Muslims became a plaything, like a piece of chess on a vicious board that was way beyond their pay grade, way beyond their understanding. And unfortunately, perhaps the greatest catalyst, they were lured into a global war that we now call World War I. They were lured into a global war even though they didn't have to take part. They were made promises, they were dangled with incentives, and so they took sides in a global war that had nothing to do with them. And unfortunately, it's Allah's qadr, they chose the wrong side. They chose the losing side. They chose to side with Germany against the Allied forces, against England and the other superpowers. And so when Germany collapsed, because Germany lost World War I, when Germany collapsed, then obviously the European powers were able to invade Muslim lands directly. Allied forces invaded and conquered Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Empire. British forces entered Baghdad in the early part of this century, of the last century. And then they entered Jerusalem and they conquered Jerusalem. And then eventually they entered Istanbul and deposed the Ottoman Sultan. But it wasn't an outsider. It was not an outsider that abolished the caliphate. No. What is so painful, and this shows us that we have enemies from within, just like we have enemies from without. What is so painful was that the actual abolishment of the Khilafah came at the hands of somebody who was born in a Muslim family and given a Muslim name. And perhaps the most painful, the name he was given was a name that also belonged to our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I mean by this, Mustafa Kemal, who is called Ataturk. And he was the one who instigated the official abolishment of the Khilafah 100 years ago. The results were catastrophic, to say the least. So much can be said. Firstly, and there's no doubt this is the biggest of them, the loss of an institution that had been continuously operating from the beginning of Islamic civilization. An institution that was put into place by no one less than our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The institution of a global authority. The institution of a figurehead that is going to lead all of the Muslim empire. And that is of the Khilafah. Agreed, it wasn't a perfect institution. Yes, it had its ups and downs. And we had bad Khalifas and we had good Khalifas. But it was something. And it was something that we could rightfully take pride in. It was a symbol of a civilization, our civilization. A symbol of a political force, our political force. Throughout 13 and a half centuries, many dynasties came and went. Many dynasties rose and fall, and they took over the status of the Khilafah. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Mamluks, the Seljuks, the Ottomans. But there was always a continuous Khalifa from the time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh up until 100 years ago. There was a continuous Khalifa. Maybe different backgrounds, different regions, different names, but there was indeed a Khalifa for our faith and our civilization. And regardless of the calamities that took place, and how many have they been, perhaps of the greatest of the calamities in our history was the advent of the Crusades, and perhaps the second worst tragedy, politically speaking, after the collapse of the Khilafah was the invasion of the Mongols, Huraku Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, attacking Baghdad and bringing the Abbasid Khilafah to an end in 1258. But even that, the Khilafah was revived under the Mamluks, and it lasted for a century or two before the Ottomans took it over. Even the collapse of Baghdad, which was indeed very traumatic, did not bring the Khilafah to an end. All of this happened only 100 years ago. So this is the first of many, many negatives. The second negative that resulted is a reality that we're all living with as we sit here right now. A reality that was unknown 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago. It is a reality that every one of us sitting here is not just aware of, we are involved with. And that is nation states. In the pre-modern times, Muslims identified with their faith and then with a broad ethnic group, their language, their culture. The concept of dividing imaginary lines between people who shared the same heritage, the same language, the same cuisine, the same ethnicity was non-existent. But with the collapse of the Khilafah and with the carving up of the Ottoman Empire, in particular with that infamous treaty known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And I want every one of you to study this agreement. There's a Wikipedia page or there's a YouTube tutorial for high school students. It's enough for us to understand. Two Western ambassadors, one French and one British, literally sat down, Sykes and Picot, between a map of the Middle East and they negotiated, and they bartered, and they fought over where they would draw the lines to divide the pie. The pie, our pie. You know when kids come and they fight over the pie, the parent comes and has to cut it up? That's exactly what happened with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That pie was our ummah. It was a map of our, and literally we have the original. You can Google it. We have the original map that Sykes and Picot are fighting over. And they decide this is the border of Syria. This is the border of Lebanon. This is the border of Palestine. This is the border of Iraq. And those borders are exactly the borders that we're still having to this day. Imaginary lines between people of the same background, same religion, same ethnicity. And now what happens? We are all at war with one another. كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. This person hates that person. This person's bombing the other person. And we have the same God and the same heritage and the same religion and the same qibla. The concept of nation state was brought in by outsiders and then handed to us. And now all of us, we are caught up in that wave as well. The third negative of the collapse of the Khilafah, and it is indeed a painful negative, was that it paved the way for the loss of Palestine and the brutal occupation of that region by the only remaining apartheid regime in the world today. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and then the Balfour Declaration were both instrumental in the destruction and the displacement of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and the substitution of local residents of that land, residents that had lived there for 2,000 years, since before the coming of Jesus Christ, the same people lived there. Their fates might have changed, but it's that ethnicity. But because of the collapse of the Khilafah and World War I and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, those people that lived there for thousands of years were shepherded into refugee camps, bombed and killed, and then immigrants brought in from Russia, from Europe, immigrants that spoke a different language, had a different background, belonged to a different faith. And then this country came, which is the only apartheid country that still remains alive to this day. And this is because, once again, of the collapse of the Khilafah. Fourthly, another negative that resulted was that it resulted, this isn't fully a negative, there's also some positives here, is that it resulted in different movements and revivalistic attempts across the globe. The collapse of the Khilafah resulted directly in thinkers attempting to revive the ummah. What is to be done? And so many global movements came about as a result of this. And we're all familiar with them. The Ikhwan, Jamaat-e-Islami, the Tahrir, all of these movements are a direct result of the collapse of the Khilafah. And they're all attempting to do something, i.e. bring about their own versions of it. And these revivalistic movements created a ripple effect across the globe. Alhamdulillah, much of it is positive, but we learn from the past. Also in India, a movement sprang up called the Khilafat movement. And that Khilafat movement, it was one of the main catalysts, not the only, one of the main catalysts for the eventual creation of the nation state of Pakistan. This is the direct result of the collapse of the Khilafah, believe it or not. Because many of those that were involved in the Khilafat movement, when that fizzled out, they then jumped on to a new idea, a new project, and that project was the creation of the nation state of Pakistan. And the last point I want to mention, and again, this is such a summary, so much needs to be said, is that the collapse of the Khilafah, it caused an intellectual and even a religious crisis across the Muslim globe. Thinkers were literally in shock. They couldn't imagine a civilization of our faith without an icon that represents the faith. How can you have a civilization of Islam without a land of Islam? That has never happened since the time of Medina. Never. And it sent ulama across the globe into a type of shock. And questions began to be asked. And these questions don't have easy answers. In fact, we are still negotiating them to this day. What is the future of a land of Islam? What is the future of Islam without a land of Islam? What is the future of a civilization without a caliphate that is supposed to be the symbol of that civilization? What does it mean to be a Muslim in modernity? How do we navigate our conflicting loyalties when we have these nation states and we have the ummah? And these are questions and controversies that are still shaping our discourses to this day. We haven't even answered all of these questions. Or I should say, the answers that are being attempted, they are not satisfactory to every single Muslim. The abolishment of the Khilafah is a topic that every single one of us, without exception, needs to study and learn lessons from. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless me and you with and through the Quran, and may He make us of those who its verses they understand and applies halal and haram throughout our lifespan. I ask Allah's forgiveness. You as well ask Him, for He is the Ghafoor and the Rahman.